the 100th anniversary of Second Union School. Second Union School, like most Rosenwald schools, was built because two men from totally different environments and backgrounds, Booker T. Washington, a former slave and civil rights activist, and Julius Rosenwald, a rich Jewish philanthropist, devised a plan that would provide education for Black rural students in the segregated South. As designed, the plan led to citizens and local officials, both Black and white, all working for a common goal. The support for Second Union School, now Second Union Rosenwald School Museum, continues today through the efforts of many of you. And on behalf of Second Union Rosenwald School Museum, I'd like to say thank you so very much.
Introduce Dr. Morris. Dr. Morris, I introduce you to Second Union. Thank you so much. Thank you, Brian, for that wonderful introduction. Brian and I had a chance to chat just a little bit before I came up here. And he told me, as he told all of you, that he is studying education and that he wants to be a teacher, which I think is very admirable. We need more males, Black males in the classroom. But what he didn't share with you was that he also wants to be a principal and a superintendent of schools. So give him a hand, yes. I am so honored to be here with you this evening. Good evening, everybody. Good evening. And to be with the Second Union Rosenwald School Museum. Thank you for inviting me to be a part of this anniversary celebration. I'm very humbled to have the blood of Booker T. Washington flowing through my veins. And so when I think about Rosenwald schools and what that educational opportunity meant for so many people, it's almost overwhelming to be a part of this. So I thank you all very much for inviting me to be here. I'd also like to thank Dr. Parchman for the invitation and for all that you do to lead the board, Mrs. Tyler, Mr. Hopkins, the Second Union Rosenwald School Museum board members, and the Centennial Anniversary Committee, and of course all of the sponsors that are here. On behalf of the family of Booker T. Washington, we thank each and every one of you for working so hard to lift up the life and legacy of our great ancestor and to make sure that that legacy continues in the education through all of the young people that are connected and having an opportunity to visit and learn about the Rosenwald schools and the Booker T. Washington legacy. So thank you all, and thank you all for coming. As I was introduced, I thought I heard Brian say, I'm the great, great, great grandson of Frederick Douglass. And you notice it's hard to count those greats. And also the great, great grandson of Booker T. Washington. And I understand exactly the difficulties he had trying to get all of those greats straight, because not only is it a mouthful trying to say it, but it sometimes makes me feel like I am far removed. And you may be sitting there having a hard time trying to imagine my connection is to Douglass and to Washington. It's kind of like trying to picture what $1 billion looks like with so many zeros. But many people know or knew a grandparent. Some of you may have even known a great grandparent. And that's how close I feel to both of my ancestors, because you see, my great grandmother, Fanny Douglass, to whom I was very close, she lived to be 103 years old. And she met Frederick Douglass when she was a little girl. She was about 8 or 9 years old, and she didn't know that she was going to grow up and marry his grandson, but that's what happened. And my Aunt Portia, to whom I was also very close, lived to be 95, and she was Booker T. Washington's daughter. And I remember being a little boy and sitting on my great-grandmother Fanny Douglass's lap, as she would tell me what it was like to know, as she would call him the man with the great big white hair. And I remember sitting on my Aunt Portia's lap, and she would tell me firsthand stories about her father, Booker T. Washington. And a few years ago, I was with a group of 6th grade students, and they were all looking at me almost cross-eyed, like, man, you are so far removed, and what does all of this history have to do with my life today? And so I was trying to give them some context and help them wrap their minds around how close we actually are. And I had this thought that hands, it actually touched the great Frederick Douglass. And hands that touched the great Booker T. Washington also touched mine.
Yes.
So in a sense, even with all of those greats, I can say I stand just one person away from history. I stand one person away from each man, and I stand one person away from slavery.
All right.
We're not that far removed from the history of slavery in this country. And I've had the honor and privilege to travel around the world and to dialogue with tens of thousands of students to really help them understand how we arrived to where we are today. And so what I hope to do this evening with my remarks is make this history come alive for you. I'm going to tell you about two men that were born into slavery. They were born into the most horrific conditions that a human being could be subjected to, but yet through the power of education. Now, we know it was illegal to teach an enslaved person to read and write, so both of my ancestors would have to steal their education. And in fact, Frederick Douglass, later in life, people would see this white-haired statesman who was the first African-American nominated for Vice President of the United States, first African-American ambassador and Consul General of Haiti, first African-American U.S. Marshal, first African-American to have a statue dedicated in his honor, first African-American recorder of deeds for the District of Columbia, and the list would go on and on and on. And they would say, Frederick, I need to know, where did you go to school? Where did you get your education? And having never spent one day of his life in a classroom, he would sometimes respond by saying, my degree is written on my back.
All right.
When he wrote his first autobiography, The Narrative of the Life of Frederick Douglass, an American Slave, which was published in 1845, he wrote, the pen with which I'm putting these words down to paper, I could rest in the cracks and fissures of my feet that have never closed shut from those cold winter nights, never having socks or a pair of shoes. And so I'm going to talk to you about these two men, and my main theme is going to be this theme of education. Now, Booker T. Washington benefited from the work of Frederick Douglass and the abolitionists, and he was free when the Emancipation Proclamation was signed, and he was 9 years old, and he was able to begin his lessons in the classroom. And so I hope that I'll be able to make this history come alive for you this evening, and that you'll walk away inspired by the stories of not only my ancestors, but all of the great heroes and heroines that came before us. But before I jump into all of that, I have to get a couple of things out of the way. I get a couple of questions when people meet me for the first time, and one of them is, so you're related to Frederick Douglass and to Booker T. Washington? Well, what do you do? And they always follow that up with, and it better be good. So I will tell you about what I do as president of the Frederick Douglass Family Initiatives and why we still need abolitionists today, because slavery did not end with the ratification of the 13th Amendment.
Amen.
Now, the other question that I get, and Brian addressed it in the opening of his opening remarks, but I know that Douglass and Washington were related to each other. How is it they're related to both of them? Anybody wondering that? Okay, well, here's how it happened. It was on my mother's side. My grandfather, my mother's father, Frederick Douglass III, was Frederick Douglass's great-grandson. And my grandmother, my mother's mother, Nettie Hancock Washington, was Booker T. Washington's granddaughter. They met in 1941 at Tuskegee Normal School and Institute. They happened to be on campus the same day. Now, my grandmother had been born in Tuskegee, but she was living in California at the time. My grandfather was a surgeon, and he was commissioned down there by the Veterans Administration during World War II. And so they just happened to be on campus. She was home visiting friends for the summer. And they were rushing across to get to the other side of campus, and they literally bumped into each other. Didn't know that the other descended from an historic family. They fell in love at first sight and wound up getting married 3 months later. Wow was right. Now, I think that God probably had a plan there, but as the father of 2 daughters myself, I don't recommend you young people getting married after only knowing somebody for 3 months. But that's exactly what happened. So that's how the families came together, and how it is that I happen to carry the blood of both of these great American heroes in my veins. And so Frederick Douglass was born Frederick Augustus Washington David. He was born on the eastern shore of Maryland to an enslaved woman and to a white man, and it was presumed that his father was his master. He never had a pair of pants or shoes until he was about 6 or 7 years old. He used to sleep head first in an old corn sack on cold winter nights with his feet hanging out because that was the only way he could try and keep himself warm. He only saw his mother 4 or 5 times his whole life, and that's because she lived on a plantation that was 12 miles away. So in order for her to see her son, she would have to work in the fields picking cotton from sunup to sundown, walk 12 miles in the middle of the night, and spend just a few precious moments with him. And he was about a year old when he was taken away from his mother. And she would stay with him until he would fall asleep, and then she would have to walk 12 miles back so she could be back on the plantation by the time the sun came up, because if she wasn't, she was most likely going to face a brutal beating. But he did early on have someone in his life that showed him some love and nurturing, and that was his grandmother, Betsy. Her job on the plantation was to raise the master's children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren, and to raise the slaves until they were old enough to really begin their life in manual labor. And on this plantation, that was around 5 or 6 years old. Now, you'll notice I'll use age ranges for Douglass's life and his age, and that's because he didn't know when he was born. There were no birth certificates for enslaved Africans, and he would later choose February 14th as his birthday because his mother used to call him her little Valentine. This happens to be the bicentennial of Frederick Douglass's birth. This year, on February 14, 2018, we celebrated another important anniversary, and that's the 200th anniversary of his birth. So we sit in this room this evening celebrating some pretty historic milestones in the history of our country. And again, when I think about that, it does kind of place some sort of weight of expectation on me, an obligation to carry on these legacies. I'll talk about that in just a little bit. But Frederick Douglass's grandmother said to him when he was 5 or 6 years old, "Freddie, we're going to go on a long journey." And that journey was a 20-mile walk to the main plantation, the White House plantation, where she had done this many times before, where she walked these young kids into slavery, but really this was the first time she was walking her own kin into slavery. And so if you think about this long journey, and this little boy who's scared, he's clinging to his grandmother's skirt. She's probably carrying him much of the way when his legs wouldn't carry himself. And they would finally make that last mile journey from the street up the driveway to the White House plantation, and Frederick would run off just to check out his surroundings. And when he turned back to look for his grandmother, she was gone. So at this point now, he's truly an orphan. So you have this little boy that had no family, he had no home, and he had no country. But in spite of all of that, through education, he was able to rise up to go on to affect change in the lives of millions of people. And so for young people that we come into contact with, that legacy becomes a tangible example to any young person that's facing challenges and obstacles, which we all have and we know our young people do, that if they were able to rise up and overcome slavery to go on to affect change in the world around them, there's nothing that a young person can't do in their lives today. But Frederick had what he called divine intervention in his favor happen. And that was around 7 or 8 years old. He was chosen from all of the slave children on this very big plantation to go to Baltimore to be the house servant for his master's brother. Now, the importance of this move was he was leaving in an environment where he wouldn't be around people that could help him to learn to read and write. He was going to be in Baltimore. He was going to be in the big city. He would be around free black children that knew how to read and write. He would be around poor white children. What happened most importantly, and I hope you listen closely to the story because What happens next is that the foundation of the work that we do around human trafficking prevention education is the foundation of everything that we do in classrooms around the country. And that was when he got to Baltimore, his slave mistress, Sophia Auld, had never had a slave before. And she didn't know that it was illegal to teach him to read and write. She was a kind Christian lady who had a young boy that she was teaching, and she saw this bright little boy who was eager to learn, and so she begins to teach young Frederick his ABCs. That's all he needed, was that little spark of light. But when his master found out about the lessons, he got angry, and he forbade the teachings, and he looked at his wife, and he looked at young Frederick, and he said, "You cannot teach a slave how to read and write, because if you do, it will unfit him to be a slave." Did you all hear that message? It will unfit him to be a slave, and his master went on to say he'll be running away with himself. And so Frederick looked at his master, shows you how smart he was, how bright he was. And he looked at him and he said, if you don't want me to have this, I'm going to do everything in my power to gain it. And he understood right then and there that knowledge is power. Is that a message that we hear today? And education would be his pathway to freedom. And so he begins to teach himself to read and write. And he was very clever in the way that he went about doing this. Now remember, he's interacting with the young kids in the community, in the city. And so he would pick up a stick off the ground and he would scratch in the dirt or scratch in the wall. He would say, "Susie, is this how you write an S?" And she would take the stick away and say, "No, Freddie, this is how you write an S." And he would file it away with it. And he would go on to the next lesson. And he would carry bread in his pocket, and he would trade that bread for reading lessons with the poor white kids in the community. Now, he wrote in that autobiography I talked about a few minutes ago, he said, "I was always so hungry as a slave child. I always had this pit of hunger in my stomach that would never go away. And on occasion, when I would get food,